Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My Uncle Ben ran an old self-storage facility just outside Kessler, New Jersey, tucked away past the bend on Route 47. The place wasn't much to look at, a collection of squat metal units arranged in two long rows, surrounded by overgrown pine trees and a rusted chain-link fence with a gate that would jam if you weren't careful closing it. Ben had been operating that facility for over 15 years by the time this story takes place, and I'd helped him out plenty of times when I was younger, changing locks, clearing out abandoned units, dealing with the occasional spider infestation when the exterminator didn't show up. So when Ben called me one evening and asked if I could cover the night shifts for a couple of weeks while he recovered from shoulder surgery, I didn't hesitate. He offered to pay me in cash, and honestly, the job seemed simple enough. Stay awake, log anyone who came in after hours, and make sure the place didn't catch fire or get broken into. I was between jobs at the time, still trying to figure out what direction my life was heading, so the timing actually worked out perfectly. I thought it might even be nice, you know? Some quiet time to myself, away from the noise and stress of normal life. I brought books, my laptop, plenty of snacks. I figured I'd catch up on some reading, maybe watch some shows and pocket some easy money in the process. The office itself was a time capsule from 1996. Everything was beige. The walls, the filing cabinet, the ancient desk that wobbled if you leaned on it wrong. There was a dusty fake plant in the corner that I'm pretty sure had been there since the place opened, and a filing cabinet that stuck every single time you tried to open it. The heater was this ancient metal box that coughed and wheezed when it kicked on, but at least it worked. There was also a small monitor setup that showed grainy black and white feeds of each row of units cycling through cameras every few seconds. The lot had about 50 units total, and most of them were either completely vacant or hadn't been opened in years. Some had belonged to people who'd stopped paying and just abandoned whatever was inside. Others were packed with the forgotten belongings of people who'd moved away or passed on. It was the kind of place where time just seemed to stop. The first 2 nights were completely uneventful, exactly what I'd expected. I stayed in the office, streamed old episodes of Mythbusters on my laptop, and drank way too much coffee from my dented thermos. The air outside was dry and sharp at night, carrying that crisp bite that only comes in late autumn. The silence out there was profound. Not peaceful exactly, but empty in a way that made you hyper-aware of every little sound. The kind of quiet that makes you notice how loud your own breathing is or how much noise your chair makes when you shift your weight. Then came the 3rd night, and that's when everything changed. It was around 2:30 in the morning. I'd just finished eating a lukewarm cup of gas station chili, not my finest culinary moment, and I was debating whether I could risk taking a short nap without technically breaking the rules Ben had given me. That's when I noticed something on the monitor. One of the units had its light on, not flickering like a power surge, but fully illuminated from the inside. Unit 42. That unit had always stood out to me because it was the only one with its own interior light, a long fluorescent strip bolted to the ceiling inside. None of the other units had anything like that. I checked the gate logs. No entries. Nobody had driven in since I'd arrived from my shift at 10 o'clock. The place was completely locked down, exactly as it should be. Still, policy was policy. If a door was open or a light was on, I had to investigate and document it. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out into the cold. Each step crunched hard against the gravel like I was walking on broken glass. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my flashlight beam bounced across the rows of units, catching peeling paint and spots of rust on the metal doors. When I reached Unit 42, I stopped. The door was cracked open. Not wide, maybe 6 inches. Just enough for light to spill out onto the gravel. I called out twice, my voice sounding thin in the night air, and waited for a response. Nothing. I pulled the door open the rest of the way, and that fluorescent light buzzed above me like it was struggling to stay alive. The unit was packed with the usual junk you'd expect. Cardboard boxes with torn labels, a treadmill missing one handle, a cracked Rubbermaid bin overflowing with old clothes. But there was something else in there, something that immediately caught my attention. Leaned carefully against the back wall was an enormous mirror, easily 7 feet tall with this incredibly ornate carved frame. The wood was dark and polished, covered in these intricate vine-like patterns that curled and twisted in ways that seemed almost organic. It looked like something you'd find in an old Victorian mansion or an estate sale for some wealthy family's abandoned property. Here's what made it strange, though. The mirror was pristine. I mean absolutely spotless. No dust, no smudges, not even fingerprints on the glass. Everything else in that unit looked like it hadn't been touched in a decade, covered in layers of grime and cobwebs, but this mirror, it looked like someone had just finished polishing it that very day. I stepped closer, mostly out of curiosity. I'm not gonna lie, I expected to just see my own reflection looking tired and cold, maybe give myself a once-over and then get back to the warm office. But the second I got within a few feet of that mirror, something felt fundamentally wrong. It was my reflection, yeah, same jacket, same jeans, same exhausted expression, but my chest was moving. Not my actual chest, just the reflection. It was breathing rapidly, almost hyperventilating like I'd just sprinted full speed across the entire facility. But I was standing perfectly still. I wasn't even breathing hard. I froze completely, just standing there watching this thing that looked exactly like me gasping for air in the reflection while I held my breath. My hands slowly dropped away from the flashlight, which I hadn't even realized I was gripping so tightly. We stared at each other, me and this other version of me, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the reflection stopped. The rapid breathing ceased, and the reflection became normal again, perfectly matching my stillness. I backed out of that unit without another word, pulling the door shut hard enough to make it rattle in its frame. I locked it, checked it twice to make sure it was secure, and walked back to the office on legs that felt like they weren't quite connected to my body. Back inside, I grabbed my phone and called Ben. It was almost 3 in the morning, and he answered sounding half asleep, his voice rough and confused. When I told him what I'd just seen, trying to keep my voice steady and not sound completely unhinged, he didn't even pretend to be surprised. He didn't tell me I was imagining things, or that it was just a trick of the light, or that I needed to get more sleep. He just said, very quietly, "Don't go back in there. That unit's been strange for years. I should have warned you." That was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just a warning delivered in a tone that suggested he'd been waiting for this exact phone call for a very long time. I asked him what he meant, what had happened before, but he said we'd talk about it when he got back and that I should just stay in the office for the rest of the night. Then he hung up. The next night, I tried to ignore it. I even flipped the monitor off completely and kept the window blinds in the office closed so I wouldn't accidentally see anything I didn't want to see. I figured if I didn't look, I wouldn't have to deal with whatever the hell was going on with Unit 42. But around 1:45 in the morning, the monitor flickered on by itself. Just static at first, that gray and white snow you used to see on old TVs. Then, after a few seconds, a clear image appeared on the screen. The door to Unit 42 was rolling open. Slowly, deliberately, like someone was carefully pushing it from the inside. I stared at that screen for way too long, my coffee going cold in my hand, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just stay exactly where I was, locked in the office until sunrise. But another part, The stupid part, probably, felt like I needed to see this through, needed to understand what was happening. I grabbed the flashlight again and headed out, my heart hammering in my chest the entire walk across the gravel lot. When I got to Unit 42, the door was closed. Not just closed, locked, exactly as I'd left it the night before. I stood there for a solid minute, shining my flashlight at the lock, at the door, looking for any sign that it had been opened recently. Nothing. I unlocked it, slowly pulled the door open and shined my light inside. The unit was completely empty. No boxes, no treadmill, no cracked bins, and no mirror. Just bare concrete walls and floor, and the soft echo of my own footsteps as I stepped inside, trying to process what I was seeing. I turned to head back, already planning to call Ben again and probably quit this job immediately, when I saw something move in the reflection on another unit's door across the way, just a blur of motion, like someone quickly ducking behind me, trying to stay out of sight. I spun around fast, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nobody there, nothing but empty air and shadows. I ran back to the office, and I'm not ashamed to admit it was a full-on sprint, and slammed the door behind me, locking it and pushing the desk chair up against it for good measure. My hands wouldn't stop shaking for almost an hour. I kept telling myself it was just stress, just my imagination running wild after a couple of weird nights, just exhaustion playing tricks on my perception. But I didn't believe it. Not really. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, I heard knocking. Not on the office door, but on the back window, that narrow, rectangular window behind the desk that faces the gravel lot. I hadn't looked at it all night. Had been actively avoiding it, actually. I sat there, frozen for a moment, the knocking coming in groups of 3. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock, knock. Every part of my brain was screaming at me not to look, to just ignore it until sunrise, but I couldn't stop myself. I moved toward that window slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, and I carefully lifted one slat of the blinds. What I saw made my legs almost give out. The mirror was back. It was propped up against the outside of the window facing in toward me, positioned perfectly so that I could see a reflection of myself standing there looking out. But the reflection wasn't moving, wasn't blinking. The eyes were wide, too wide, unnaturally wide, like someone trying to mimic what a normal expression looks like but getting it slightly wrong. The mouth was set in this almost smile that didn't reach the eyes. I stood there paralyzed, unable to look away, my breath fogging up the glass between me and whatever that was. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Could have been 30 seconds, could have been 10 minutes. Time felt weird and elastic. But eventually the darkness started to lighten, that deep black of night gradually shifting to the dark blue of pre-dawn, and when I looked again, the mirror was gone. Just vanished, as if it had never been there at all. I left the keys on the counter that morning, didn't even bother leaving a note. I just got in my car as soon as the sun was fully up and drove home without looking back once. 3 weeks later, Ben's wife called me. Her voice was shaky and quiet, and I knew something was wrong before she even said it. Ben had died in his sleep. Stroke, the doctor said. Relatively peaceful, all things considered. But she mentioned something odd, something that stuck with her and clearly disturbed her enough that she felt the need to tell me about it. When they found Ben that morning, he was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open, looking like he'd been frozen mid-thought. His face had this expression of intense concentration, or maybe recognition, like he'd just realized something important. And there was a shard of glass in his hand. A small piece, maybe an inch long, but sharp enough that it had cut deep into his palm. Blood had dried around his fingers, and they'd had to pry the glass out of his grip. The medical examiner ruled it a natural death. The glass was just incidental, unexplained but not suspicious. I never told her about Unit 42 or the mirror, or any of it. What would be the point? It wouldn't bring Ben back, and it wouldn't give her any peace. Some things, I think, are better left alone in the dark where they belong. I've never worked night security since then, and I'll never, ever look too long at my own reflection in a strange mirror. Back when I was 24, I was working nights at the Bellman Theatre downtown. From the outside, the place was beautiful, all marble floors and shiny brass fixtures, restored to this slightly over-the-top version of what it might have looked like in its 1940s heyday. I was the overnight supervisor for the cleanup crew, working from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, making sure everything was spotless before the daytime staff arrived. It was usually pretty straightforward work. Vacuum the carpets, wipe down the brass, restock the bathrooms, empty the trash. Nothing complicated. But the building itself? The building had a presence, especially at night. One Thursday night in early March, 2 of our regular cleaners, Marcel and Gina, both called out sick. I remember being annoyed because they always brought good coffee on our breaks, and their absence meant I'd be covering their sections upstairs by myself. The upper levels of the Bellman were always strange. The acoustics up there did something weird to sound. You'd hear footsteps a second or two after you moved, like the building was echoing your movements back to you on a delay. Or voices would bounce in ways that made you stop and turn around, convinced someone had just whispered right behind you, only to find the hallway completely empty. But I'd gotten used to it over the months I'd worked there. You adapt to weird things when you're around them long enough. They become part of the background, just another quirk of the job. Around midnight, I was up in one of the supply rooms off the second-floor hallway, logging our cleaning supplies on my tablet. Paper towels, check. Degreaser, check. Toilet paper, industrial cleaner, mop heads. Standard inventory stuff. That's when I noticed the red binder. It was just sitting there on top of the utility sink, plain red cover, slightly frayed at the corners. We didn't use physical binders for anything. All our records were digital, stored in the cloud, accessible from tablets. Everything had been converted years ago to save space and make records easier to search. I couldn't remember ever seeing this binder before, and I'd been in this supply room hundreds of times. Curious, I picked it up and opened it. The first page was labeled Stage Left Storage Archive in thick black pen. Underneath was a detailed list: inventory boxes, props, lighting gels, cables, furniture pieces, all handwritten in neat, precise lettering. I frowned. Stage left storage? That section had been sealed off since long before I started working here. Management said the stairs down to that area were structurally unstable, and they'd blocked access with a locked door and warning signs. No one had been down there in years, possibly decades. I closed the binder, figured it was just some weird leftover from an old inventory system, and made a mental note to ask about it. I marked it as found item in my shift notes, tucked it under my arm, and brought it back down to the front office. I locked it inside the cabinet under the main desk, double-checked the lock, actually, and wrote down the time in my log, 12:17 a.m. Then I went back upstairs to continue my rounds. About an hour later, I was doing another sweep of the supply rooms, and when I passed that same room where I'd found the binder, I stopped cold. It was back, sitting on the exact same shelf at the exact same angle, like it had never moved. My heart started beating faster. I walked back downstairs, moving quickly now, and checked the cabinet in the front office. Still locked. I fumbled with my keys, got it open, and looked inside. Empty. No binder. I stood there for a long moment, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe I'd forgotten to actually put it in there. Maybe I'd set it down somewhere else and was misremembering. But I knew I hadn't. I remembered locking that cabinet. I'd heard the click. I'd tested the handle. I went back upstairs, picked up the binder again. It felt slightly cold to the touch, like it had been sitting in a refrigerator. and walked straight back down to the front office. This time, I didn't put it in the cabinet. I placed it directly on the desk, right in the middle of the frame of our security camera so that any movement would be captured on video. I watched the monitor for a few seconds, confirming the binder was clearly visible in the feed. Then I turned away to fill out some paperwork. 15 minutes later, I checked the footage. The binder wasn't there. Not in the live feed and not in the recorded footage. I rewound the video, watching myself place something invisible on the desk, my hands miming the action of setting down an object that the camera couldn't see. One frame showed the empty desk. The next frame, still empty. There was no moment where the binder existed in the footage, even though I'd seen it with my own eyes, held it in my own hands. I felt cold all over, like I'd just stepped into a freezer. I went back upstairs one more time, and there it was. Same spot, same angle, waiting. This time I didn't touch it. I just stood in the doorway for a few minutes, staring at it, trying to understand what this meant. Then I left, closing the door behind me, and continued with my work. Later that night, probably around 3 in the morning, I was walking the upper hallway to lock up the restrooms before heading home. I passed the usual row of dressing rooms and service closets, and as I reached the recycling bin near the back staircase, I noticed one door standing slightly ajar. It had a small brass plaque, Performer Lounge. That area hadn't been restored yet. It was part of the old section of the building, where the walls were still water-stained and the carpet was torn up in places. As far as I knew, no one had been in there in years. The only key that existed was on my ring. I pushed the door open slowly. The air inside was colder than the rest of the floor. Not just cool, actually cold. The kind of cold that makes your teeth ache and your breath visible, like something had sucked all the warmth out of the room and was holding it somewhere else. The room was mostly empty. A row of vanity mirrors lined one wall, most of the bulbs either cracked or missing entirely. Dust clung to every surface in thick, undisturbed layers. A few metal stools sat scattered across the space, one knocked over on its side. There was a folding dressing screen in the corner with a long diagonal tear in the fabric. And in the middle of the room, lying open on the floor, was the binder. But it was different now. This was a different page. The handwriting looked the same, that neat, deliberate print, but the heading had changed. This one said, Entries. Beneath it were 5 names, first and last. No dates, no job titles, no context. Just names written in a vertical list. I only recognized one of them. Mine, next to my name, written in small capital letters, was a single word. Filed. I don't remember closing the door or walking back down the hallway. The next thing I clearly remember is sitting in my car in the parking lot, engine running, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I called in sick the next night, sent a text about a migraine and stared at my phone for hours, waiting for some kind of response or follow-up question. Nothing came. Just a short reply. Okay. Feel better? I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear sounds, soft metallic clangs like pipes settling or footsteps on the floor above my apartment. Except I lived on the top floor. By the following evening, I felt ridiculous. I told myself I was being dramatic, letting my imagination run away with me. It was probably just an elaborate prank by one of the other staff members, or maybe some weird remnant from a previous employee who'd kept odd records. I decided to finish out the week and then quit properly, give my 2 weeks' notice like a professional. Everything seemed normal at first. I clocked in, did my initial rounds, checked in with the evening manager before she left. Just another shift, but around 1:30 in the morning, I ended up back in that supply room. The binder was in the utility sink this time, balanced on the edge like it had been dropped and caught itself before falling into the drain. I opened it. The names were gone. The page was blank, except for one short paragraph written in the center under a new heading. Return Directive. The handwriting was different now, shaky and small, like someone writing in a hurry or under stress. The ink was darker too, bled into the paper like it had been pressed too hard. It read, "Rehearsal incomplete. Proceed to green room." We didn't have a green room. I pulled up the theater's floor plan on my tablet, scrolling through every level, every designated space. No green room listed anywhere. But even as I told myself that, my feet were already moving. I walked down the hallway behind the main stage, past the orchestra pit entrance, past storage closets and equipment rooms. Then I saw a door I'd never paid much attention to before, unlabeled, set flush into the wall like a fire exit or utility access. I'd always assumed it led to electrical systems or ventilation equipment. I tried the knob. It was unlocked. Behind it, a staircase led downward. The air coming up from below was stale and warm, and there was light at the bottom. One single bulb swinging slightly on its cord, casting moving shadows on the walls. And I heard something. Music. A piano, specifically. Not a recording. This was a real piano. Someone playing just a few notes slowly, like someone practicing scales without much enthusiasm. I stood at the top of those stairs, not breathing, not moving, for maybe 30 seconds. Then I quietly closed the door, locked it, and backed away. Right there in the hallway, I pulled out my phone and typed out a resignation email. No notice period, no explanation, just a brief message saying I was leaving effective immediately for personal reasons. I didn't even read it over, just hit send. I turned around to head for the exit, and the binder was on the floor behind me. Not tossed there, not dropped. Placed, lying perfectly flat, like someone had knelt down and set it there carefully while my back was turned. I didn't pick it up, didn't even look at it for more than a second. I just walked straight out the main doors, crossed the street, and left it on a bench outside the sandwich shop across from the parking lot. Then I got in my car and drove home. Didn't turn on the radio, didn't stop for gas, didn't look in the rearview mirror. Just white-knuckled the steering wheel the entire way back to my apartment. I never went back to that theater. Not even to pick up my final paycheck. I had them mail it to me. And I've never, in any job since, worked in a building with a basement or sub-level that isn't regularly used. Some doors, I think, aren't meant to be opened. And some invitations aren't meant to be accepted, no matter how clearly they're written. I was 27 when I moved into that basement apartment off Harwood Street, just outside of Rochester, New York. The neighborhood wasn't great, not dangerous exactly, but run down, tired. There was an old church on the corner with boarded-up windows, and across the street was this sketchy tire shop with a busted neon sign that flickered even during the day, making this endless clicking sound that you could hear if the wind was blowing the right way. I didn't love the area, but the rent was incredibly low, and more importantly, the landlord didn't require 3 months' deposit up front, which felt like a miracle at the time. I'd been couch surfing for a few weeks after my previous living situation fell through, and I was desperate for my own space again, even if it wasn't perfect. The house itself was a red brick split level that looked like it had been sagging slightly since sometime in the 1980s. The front porch had this permanent lean to it that made you feel off balance just standing there. My apartment was the basement unit, which had its own side entrance, a feature the landlord, a guy named Vince, had really emphasized when showing me the place. "More privacy," he'd said. "You won't even know I'm up there." There was also a locked door inside my apartment that connected to the main house through a narrow staircase. We both had locks on our respective sides, so theoretically the space was completely separate and secure. But the stairs were still there, just sitting behind a hollow door, forming this weird little passage that connected our living spaces, even though neither of us was supposed to use it. I could hear Vince sometimes walking around up there. He wore heavy boots that made the floorboards creak, and occasionally late at night I'd hear him coughing. Deep, wet coughs that sounded like he'd smoked about a chimney's worth of cigarettes over the course of his life. The first time I noticed the cold patch was maybe a week after I moved in. I was doing laundry, carrying a basket from my bedroom to the small laundry alcove off the kitchen when I stepped barefoot onto something that felt fundamentally wrong. It wasn't wet, it wasn't soft, it was just cold, deeply, unnaturally cold. Like someone had replaced that specific section of concrete floor with frozen metal, a dinner plate-sized circle right in the middle of the laundry room, radiating this intense chill that shot up through my foot and into my leg. I stepped back immediately, looking down at the floor. It didn't look any different from the rest of the concrete. Same color, same texture, same slight staining from years of use. But when I slowly reached down and touched it with my hand, the cold was so intense it almost burned. After that, I started stepping around it automatically, even when I was wearing shoes or socks. Your body just does that sometimes. Develops these little routines to avoid things that feel wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly why they're bothering you. By mid-January, the Rochester winter had fully set in, and it was brutal. Single-digit temperatures, wind that cut through your jacket like it wasn't even there, that sharp, dry air that makes your nose hurt when you breathe. I kept a little space heater running in my bedroom at night just to stay sane. And during the day, I'd sometimes run it in the living room while I worked on my laptop. But even with the heater going full blast, the apartment never quite felt warm. I'd wake up in the mornings and see my breath hanging in the air, even though the heater had been running all night. The temperature gauge would say 68 degrees, but it felt at least 10 degrees colder. The night it happened, I'd gone to bed early. I was exhausted from a long shift at my retail job, and I'd fallen asleep watching something dumb on my laptop, one of those true crime shows that all blend together after a while. When I woke up, everything was wrong. The heater was off, my laptop was closed, and there was total silence. No hum from the heater, no ambient noise from outside, no sound of Vince moving around upstairs. Just this thick, suffocating quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I reached over to flick on my bedside lamp. Nothing. Tried the main light switch on the wall, also dead. Okay, I thought. Power outage. Annoying, but not the end of the world. Happens sometimes in old houses during cold snaps. I got up, mostly because I wanted my inhaler. I have mild asthma, and cold air in an unventilated space isn't great for my breathing. I always kept my inhaler on the corner of my dresser. Same spot every night, force of habit. But when I reached for it in the dark, my hand landed on smooth, empty wood. Gone. I felt around more frantically now, patting the surface of the dresser, checking behind the lamp, looking on the floor in case I'd somehow knocked it off during the night. Nothing. I pulled open the top drawer, thinking maybe I'd put it in there and forgotten, but it was just filled with socks and old receipts. Confused and starting to feel a little panicked, I looked toward the window. That tiny basement window usually let in just enough light from the porch bulb outside to give the room a faint outline, to let you know the outside world was still there even if you couldn't see much. But that night, the window was completely black. Not dark, black, like someone had painted over the glass or hung a thick blanket across it. No light at all, no variation in shade, just this solid wall of darkness where the window should be. I leaned closer, trying to understand what I was seeing, when I heard it right behind me. Close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. A man's voice. Calm and quiet and utterly certain. "You're not breathing." I spun around so fast I nearly fell, my heart exploding in my chest. The room was empty. No one there. But my chest, God, my chest was suddenly tight. My throat felt like someone was pressing it closed from the inside. I couldn't get a full breath. It felt like trying to suck air through a straw with a crack in it, where nothing actually comes through no matter how hard you try. I stumbled, dropped to my knees, tried to crawl toward my phone. It was charging on the other side of the room, the screen glowing faintly in the darkness. If I could just reach it, call for help, tell someone what was happening. My fingers barely worked. The room was tilting, my vision narrowing to a tunnel, the edges going dark and fuzzy. I got maybe halfway across the floor before my arms gave out and everything went black. When I came to, I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was on the stairs. Those locked stairs that led up to Vince's apartment. My head was resting against the bottom step, and my phone was in my hand. Unlocked, the emergency dial screen glowing. I didn't remember walking there. I didn't remember getting up off the floor, didn't remember unlocking my side of the door, didn't remember climbing any stairs. There was just the moment I passed out in my bedroom, and then this. Waking up in a place I had no memory of going. I blinked a few times, trying to clear my head. My chest still felt like it was full of sand, each breath requiring conscious effort. Then I looked up. There was someone standing on the landing above me. Not Vince. I'd met Vince enough times to know what he looked like, and this wasn't him. This guy was younger, maybe mid-30s, with shaggy dark hair and a faded Bill's hoodie, just standing there at the top of the stairs. Watching. Except he wasn't watching. Not really. His head was tilted downward like he was looking at the stairs themselves, and his eyes never quite met mine. They were pointed in my general direction, but not at me. Not focused on anything. And then, without turning his body or changing his expression, he stepped backward. Smoothly, mechanically, like he was on rails or being pulled by invisible strings. He moved backward into the shadows at the top of the staircase and just disappeared. The next thing I clearly remember is being in the hospital. Tubes in my nose, someone adjusting monitors beside my bed, bright fluorescent lights that hurt my eyes. A nurse was asking me questions I couldn't quite process, her voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. Vince had found me, apparently. Around 3:30 in the morning, he'd heard something, a thud maybe, or scratching at the connecting door, and when he came down to check, he found me passed out against the door, barely breathing. He'd called an ambulance immediately. At the hospital, they told me I'd had a severe respiratory inflammation event, like an allergic attack, but more acute and dangerous. They asked if I'd been exposed to any chemical fumes. Insulation, sealants, industrial adhesives, rubber compounds, things like that. I told them no, not that I was aware of. Later, after I was released and went back to pack up my stuff, Vince filled in some of the blanks. Turned out that unit, my basement apartment, had been renovated about 2 years earlier. They'd sealed off some old ventilation ducts and installed a new insulation, but they'd done it cheap. Some of the materials they had used released fumes when the temperature dropped below a certain point. Not enough to be immediately dangerous, but enough to cause serious respiratory problems over time, especially in someone with asthma. The landlord before Vince had known about it. That's why the rent was so low. That's why they didn't ask many questions when I applied. And the previous tenant, the one who'd lived there before me, had ended up in the hospital twice before finally breaking his lease and moving out. Young guy in his 30s. Dark hair, Bills fan. He died 6 months later. Respiratory failure in his sleep. In a different apartment across town. But Vince said he'd been off after living in that basement. Paranoid. Said he kept seeing himself in places he hadn't been, hearing his own voice when he knew he hadn't spoken. I was out of that apartment within a week, staying with a friend until I found a new place. But even now, years later, I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with my chest tight in this overwhelming certainty that I'm not alone in the room. And sometimes, just for a second, I think I see someone standing at the foot of my bed, head tilted down, eyes pointed at nothing, just watching in that not watching way. Then I blink, and they're gone. I was 28 when I took that night job at a small roadside hotel just outside a town called Red Hill Pines, about 40 minutes north of where I was living at the time. The hotel wasn't part of any chain, just one of those independent single-story places built in a U-shape around a gravel parking lot, with maybe 20 rooms total. Half the rooms had burnt-out porch lights that no one ever seemed to get around to replacing, and the sign out front used to say Cumberland Lodge, but most of the letters had peeled off over the years, so it just read Cumlo. The locals thought that was hilarious. I did too, honestly. It became a running joke whenever I told people where I worked. I'd taken the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., because the pay was slightly better and because I've always been a night person anyway. There was no other staff during those hours, no manager, no housekeeping, no maintenance. Just me, sitting at the front desk in a tiny office, checking in the occasional late-night arrival and making sure nothing caught fire or got broken into. The owner lived in New Jersey and came up maybe once a month to look at the books and make minor repairs that never quite fixed anything. The day manager lived an hour away and only showed up if something major broke. Most of the time, I had the place completely to myself, which honestly suited me fine. I'd sit at the desk drinking terrible coffee from a pot that always tasted faintly burnt, watching muted crime shows on the small TV bolted to the wall. And every so often I'd get a tired trucker or a business guy who needed a place to crash for a few hours. I'd hand over one of those old-fashioned brass keys, none of this keycard nonsense, and point them down the hallway like I was some kind of budget concierge in purgatory. Most nights were completely uneventful, quiet to the point of being almost meditative. After years of bouncing between dead-end retail jobs and temp positions with fluorescent lighting and forced small talk, sitting alone in a slightly musty room with minimal responsibilities actually felt like a relief. That particular night didn't start off feeling any different from the others. It was early November, and the wind had picked up around midnight. Not a storm exactly, just those dry autumn gusts that make dead leaves skitter across pavement and set loose objects rattling. The lobby had one of those old automatic sliding doors, the kind that operates like it's perpetually on its last legs. Every time the wind blew across the sensor, the door would drag itself open an inch or two, make this exhausted mechanical wheeze, and then snap shut like it was offended by the effort. It was annoying, but not unusual. I'd actually gotten used to it, even laughed at it sometimes. Yeah, buddy, I feel that too. Around 2 in the morning, I was wrapping up the night audit, counting cash, balancing receipts, all the usual end-of-shift prep, even though my shift wouldn't end for another 4 hours. Everything balanced perfectly. I closed the register drawer with a satisfying snap, stretched my back until it popped, and was reaching for the light switch behind the desk when the front door slid open again. I looked up, expecting to see headlights pulling into the lot or someone walking toward the entrance. Nothing. The parking lot was completely still. No cars except my beat-up Corolla sitting alone under the flickering security light. The door slid shut with a soft hiss. Wind, I figured, same as always. But something made me walk over to check anyway. Some instinct I didn't quite understand. I pressed my hand against the glass and looked out across the empty lot. No fresh tire tracks. No footprints in the thin layer of dust that had accumulated near the entrance. Just that uneasy stillness where everything looks normal but feels wrong in some indefinable way. Behind me, something hit the floor with a sharp metallic sound. Thunk. I turned fast. One of the room keys, number 6, was lying on the floor just behind the desk, a couple feet from the pegboard where it normally hung. The hook was still there, not bent or loose. The key had just fallen. These weren't light keys either. They were solid brass with thick leather tags attached, weighing a good 4 or 5 ounces. They didn't just fall off hooks for no reason. Still, I picked it up, maybe a little too quickly, and hung it back in its place, like that simple action would make everything normal again. I took one step backward, and another key fell. This time, it was number 11. It didn't just drop straight down either. It bounced off the hook below it, clattered across the counter, and hit the tile floor with a ringing sound that seemed way too loud in the silent lobby. That one I didn't hang back up. I just stared at it for a few seconds, then took a deliberate step away from the pegboard. The lobby felt wrong now. Not cold exactly, but thick, charged. Like the air right before a thunderstorm, or immediately after someone says something unforgivable and the whole room forgets how to breathe. I walked over to the front door, switched the automatic sensor off, and locked it manually with the deadbolt. Then I sat back down behind the desk, every hair on my arm standing up, telling myself I was overreacting. That's when the phone rang. Internal line. The display showed room 4. I stared at the blinking extension light for a moment, my heart rate picking up. No one was in room 4. It had been vacant for over a week. I'd even walked past it earlier in the evening during my initial rounds. Door shut, curtain pulled, same as always. I picked up the receiver slowly. Front desk. Nothing. Not even static. Just empty air. Hello? Still nothing. Then a soft click as the line disconnected. I sat there holding the phone, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Old phone systems sometimes have crossed wires, I told myself. Signal interference. A glitch in the switchboard. Then it rang again. Room 9. My stomach clenched. I picked up, trying to keep my voice even and bored. Front desk. A pause. Then a voice. Small, high-pitched, definitely a child. Are you alone? I hung up immediately, my hand shaking slightly as I put the receiver back in the cradle. I pulled up the occupancy system on the computer, even though I already knew what it would show. Rooms 2, 8, and 12 were occupied. All 3 guests had checked in earlier in the evening. All 3 were solo adult travelers, 2 business types and 1 long-haul trucker. No families, no children. I printed out the occupancy report anyway, just to have physical confirmation, and stepped out from behind the desk. I'd do a quick walk of the hallways, I decided. Confirm that nothing weird was actually happening, that all the occupied rooms were quiet, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. The hallway was its usual self, thin brown commercial carpet, buzzing overhead fluorescent lights, and that faint, sour smell of industrial air freshener trying and failing to mask mildew. I knocked softly on the door of room 4. Nothing. Silence. Same with room 9. Then I rounded the corner toward the west wing, and everything stopped. Room 6's door was wide open. Not cracked, not slightly ajar, fully open, yawning into the hallway like a mouth. I approached slowly, listening hard. The hallway was completely silent. No TV sounds, no running water, no voices, nothing. I leaned into the doorway and flicked on the overhead light. Everything looked untouched. The bed was perfectly made, crisp white sheets tucked in tight. The remote was still sitting on the nightstand. Nothing out of place, no luggage, no personal items, no sign that anyone had been in here at all. But the bathroom light was on. The door was shut, but I could see the light coming from underneath it, casting a yellow strip across the tile. I stood there in the doorway, every instinct screaming at me to just leave, to walk away and pretend I'd never seen this. But I couldn't. I had to know. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound official and calm. "This is hotel staff. If someone's in there, you're not supposed to be in this room." Nothing. I walked in slowly, crossed the small room, and put my hand on the bathroom door handle. It was cold to the touch. I turned it slowly and pushed the door open. Empty. The light was on, buzzing softly from the exhaust fan, but there was no one there. No towels disturbed, no water on the counter, no fog on the mirror. Just an ordinary, completely empty bathroom. I turned off the light, backed out of the room, locked the door behind me, and made my way back to the front desk as quickly as I could without actually running. When I got there, my stomach dropped again. 3 keys were lying on the counter now, arranged in a neat little row. 4, 9, and 6. Their hooks on the pegboard were empty. I hadn't taken them down. I'd been in the hallway. The office had been empty. Then the front door, still locked, still with the sensor turned off, clicked and began to slide open. That slow, dragging sound as it forced itself wide despite being manually locked. I turned around. There was a little girl standing just outside on the sidewalk. She looked maybe 6 or 7 years old, barefoot, wearing a thin nightgown that fluttered in the wind. Her hair was matted and tangled, like she'd been outside for hours. No coat, no shoes, no parents anywhere in sight. I stepped forward, my heart in my throat, instinct taking over. "Hey," I said gently, trying not to scare her. "Are you okay? Are you lost? Where are your parents?" She didn't answer, didn't even look at me, just stared down the length of the hallway, her expression blank and distant. Then she spoke, very softly, her voice flat and mechanical. "I need to go back to my room." "What room is that, honey?" I asked, kneeling down slightly to be at her eye level. She raised one thin arm very slowly and pointed down the hallway. "The one where I died." Every muscle in my body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she'd just said. She stepped inside without another word, walking right past me like I wasn't there. I watched, paralyzed, as she moved down the hallway in her bare feet. That's when I saw them. Wet footprints on the carpet. Small, child-sized prints, leaving damp impressions with every step she took. It hadn't rained. The ground outside was bone dry. That broke me. I turned and ran. Didn't grab my phone, didn't grab my jacket, didn't lock the door behind me. Just got in my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, and drove. I didn't stop until I saw lights at a gas station about 10 miles down the road. I sat in that brightly lit parking lot for almost 20 minutes, trying to catch my breath, before I finally called the day manager. I told him something weird had happened and I couldn't finish my shift. I didn't explain what. I couldn't find the words. He didn't press me for details, which surprised me. Just said, "Okay, we'll figure it out." Like this wasn't the first time someone had called from that hotel in the middle of the night, unable to continue. Later, when I'd calmed down enough to think somewhat rationally, I confirmed what I already knew in my gut. No children had been booked that night. No families. Just 3 adults. I never went back to the Cumberland Lodge. Texted my resignation 2 days later and took a job at a bookstore that's only open during daylight hours. Months later, curiosity got the better of me and I looked up the hotel online. It had closed that winter. A burst pipe had flooded half the rooms and the owner decided it wasn't worth repairing. The building was never reopened. I found one old article about the closure, just a short local news blurb, but buried near the bottom was a line I'll never forget. A woman had filed a lawsuit years earlier after her daughter died during a weekend stay at the hotel. Carbon monoxide leak. Room 6. The case had been settled quietly out of court. The ventilation system had been repaired, and life apparently had gone on. But I guess not for everyone.